Hi, I'm Meshal Malik and you're watching Indus Special. Now, according to UNESCO's 2020 Global Education Monitoring Report, fewer than 10% of countries have laws that help ensure full inclusion in education, which has led to more than 258 million children and youth being entirely excluded. As the pandemic unmasks the problems within equal and equitable access to education, it also gives a chance for us to reevaluate how we view inclusion for the future. Let's talk to our panel of experts and discuss this. Joining us for this conversation today is Ms. Baela Jamil, who is the CEO of Idara-e-Talim-o Agai, which is a Center for Education, and she is also a public policy specialist. She joins us from Lahore. Also joining us today is Abang, who's a Nigerian journalist, joining us from Berlin at this point in time. Also joining us is Ms. Nilofer Narli, who's a professor and the chairperson of the Department of Sociology and professor of political sociology at the Bahçeşehir University. She joins us from Istanbul. Thank you all for joining us and welcome to the show. Ms. Baela Jamil, I'd like to start off from the point that this report stresses on the most, which is, of course, inclusion, and how we still haven't come to actually achieving a definition of inclusion which deals with all the problems we have. Now, what does inclusion mean to you, and especially when we take our specific context into consideration?
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be today on Indus News, and especially in context of COVID-19, and where the issue of inclusion has, I think, finally achieved a status which it ought to, where we begin to look at inclusion not just in terms of disabilities, but really in terms of the marginalized, communities and who are becoming even more so. And especially when marginalization is doubled or tripled, if you happen to be a minority, if you happen to be a transgender, if you happen to be an LGBTI, all of this is something that really multiplies and accelerates the whole issue of inclusion. And most of the countries, as you say, in this recently launched Global Education Monitoring Report 2020, which is on inclusion, exactly says that countries, maybe 67% of the countries may have some reference to inclusion and acknowledgement of inclusion. But when it comes to definition of those 67%, only 58% would elaborate what inclusion really means. But that's not just enough. But what happens more so is when you look at budgets and planning, I think that gets even more waylaid when it comes to implementation. So we are still very rhetorical about inclusion, and it's more lip service to it than actually any implementation, not just in terms of budgets, but in terms of attitudes, in terms of facilities, in terms of a whole system which looks at its most vulnerable and its most excluded with care.
Right. Mr. Jamil, I'm going to come back to points you've mentioned here. But before that, I want to jump to Professor Narli and talk to her about what you mentioned, everything happening in context of COVID-19. Now, Professor Narli, COVID-19 by some people is being seen as a great equalizer of sorts, a chance for people to start over. Do you see that in the same light when it comes to education? Or do you think this will just exacerbate the problems we've already have?
Globalization, I have a few keywords to understand the situation. Digitalization, living in a knowledge society, information age, and in a network society. And then we will look at everything in the context of COVID-19 pandemics. The first speaker pointed out it very nicely. So when we look at the pandemic, since from the beginning of the pandemic, digitalization has accelerated. Digitalization has started with the beginning of the 21st century, even before, but with the pandemic, it has accelerated. And what happened, digital divide became more visible, and then it became a factor which deepens the existing inequalities and then bringing the new ones. Young people, people in any age, when they have the digital tools, digital skills, and internet access, they have been able to continue their education, their working. But young people, children who didn't have access to digital tools and internet, and this is the case in many of the economically disadvantaged areas in the countries, then their education is interrupted. And then some people, especially in the service sector, they lost their jobs. And then when they lost their jobs, their children are affected because of the poverty. I think we need to focus on digital gap. And digital gap is a really intervening issue. And so when we look at the Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 goals, they are about inclusion. Nobody will be left behind. They are about eradication of poverty. They are about participation of all in education, and then people realizing their potential. But what's happening is digital gap, which is a new form of exclusion, and then this is related to unequal access to new information communication technologies, ICT. And when we look at it, gender, territory, social class, maybe international gap, cognitive gaps, they are all factors associated with digital gap. And now digital gap further divides the societies, further divides the global society.
Right. Ms. Narli, of course, you mentioned the digital gap, and that is the most prominent in-your-face issue when we talk about education during this pandemic, something that we will try to address later on in the conversation. But talking about the issues that persisted prior to the pandemic, the ones that continued to cause many inequalities in access to education, I want to talk to Mercy about that. Mercy, when we talk about Nigeria, it being the most populous country in Africa, so many people to reach out to, do you feel like this issue of inclusivity was given the due attention that it requires and that it needs?
I think it hasn't. Just to start with that, rather, COVID-19 seems to have exposed the divide. It has exposed the reality of the situation. And I want to say that the divide is still there. People would assume that COVID-19 has become the leveler. I don't think so. Because if you go to Abuja, for instance, there are healthcare facilities that have been kept for the elites that are different from the masses. So how do we even say that COVID-19 has been the leveler? The only difference, however, is that this time, people do no longer have access to flying out of the country to Europe and America for healthcare like it was before. That's on one hand. On another hand, there are children of the poor and children of the rich. The children of the poor, the children of the rich are having access to gadgets. They're having access to online classes. They're having access to studying. While children of the poor do not even know what it is to have access to, what it means to have a smartphone. They don't even understand what it is to have a gadget. Because to have a gadget means you need to be able to earn a certain level of income to be able to even use a gadget, to be able to access the internet.
Mercy, on that point, I'm sorry to interject here. On that point, I do want to ask you, now we know that areas that have been hard to access in traditional means of education, those that are difficult because of geography or other factors, whatever they might be. We always saw technology as being an innovation that could close that gap. Now, when we talk about Nigeria, how much technological progress has there been in the past years to close those gaps?
Absolutely, there's been tremendous progress. I wouldn't sit back here and say there haven't been progress. We're having a country of over 200 million active mobile phones, right? So that means that there are more people, there are more people in grassroots communities that are having access to digital technology. But when I say that, then I ask you again, Nigeria is a country of an estimated 100 million poor people. And poor people, I'm not saying poor middle income earners. I'm saying poor people that are extremely poor, that all that matters to them is food.
Right.
So when people are looking for food, will they be having a conversation about having internet? When people are looking for food, will they be able to access the same level of technology with a man who is having access to all forms of smartphones that are available to his children?
Right. Mercy,
So the divide.
Right. Mercy, stay with me on that point. I'm going to take this to Ms. Jamil as well. Ms. Jamil, whatever Mercy says here, does it resonate with you as well?
Well, absolutely. I mean, Nigeria, Pakistan, we are one of the one of the 9 high populous countries of the world, suffering similar issues on account of gender and so on. But when it comes to, of course, the digitization and the edtech business and, to what extent ICTs have penetrated, Pakistan definitely has come a long way. But still, the divide is still massive. It varies from place to place. So whilst on the one hand, even in our ASA survey that we do, and we find out what is the access of an ordinary household to television, radio, cell phones, etc., we have, only 60% of the households in the rural areas, but of course, almost 90% in urban areas have access to televisions. When it comes to cell phones, I think they're there in almost 90% of the households. But when it comes to how deep the internet is, that there's a huge difference between the rural and the urban areas. So the inequity aspect has become really accelerated during this time, and therefore it needs organizations like many organizations in Pakistan who are going from solutions across the spectrum, from no tech to low tech to high tech. And of course, we are much more focused on the low tech to high. And so we've penetrated the communities through people who would go from village to village, community to community, and find activists who will be able to bridge that divide. That is a very real situation. And I think for many countries, we begin to find out what really is the big infrastructure gap which we have when it comes to technology. Now, the good thing is that some of it, the costs have come so, they have really become very low. So if the government was to think about some structural changes or to be able to do things which would be, I would consider a social safety net, I would urge very much that government should think in terms of having more digitization access for the poorest. We gave 12,000 rupees per family for food, which lasted maybe even 15 days for a family. But how about giving them a digitization access which will transform the life of one family?
Right.
That is something that I think that we need to do.
Right. Ms. Jamil, just one question on this, which comes to my mind when I hear what you have to say, what Mercy says, what Professor Narli says, which is that COVID-19 and this pandemic has unmasked many structural issues. Now, it has unmasked them, and these weren't completely out of sight before either. Why do you think, and especially when I talk about South Asia at large, the issue which leads to gaps in educational attainment was ignored? Because, of course, it's been exacerbated, but it has also been ignored for quite some time now.
We have been living in an emergency, Meshal, as you know, an education emergency since 2009, which is when, it splashed all over that we are in an education emergency. And that became a pet phrase for every political campaign for the elections, whether it was 2013 or whether it was 2018. But we have been in a long education emergency. And that has completely skyrocketed during this period when we are talking already about not just in learning losses, about which we know a lot, but also it's going to be, sadly, enrollment losses as well. Now, the government is taking cognition of that. This government has been very open about the issue of the education emergency and the learning crisis and so on, with 19 million children still out of school. But what really still needs to be uncovered a little bit more, and I'm sure it will resonate both with Turkey and with Nigeria, that the urban slums, which form, for example, in Karachi, you'll be shocked, about 60% of Karachi's population are still lying unignored. That's where the COVID spikes are. That's where there is no facility. They cannot wash hands and so on.
Right.
We are almost 40% urbanized, but we're not planning for them. We're not planning for our urban slums. That's where
the problem
divide
lies.
is.
Right.
That's where the problem lies. That's where the spikes are coming from. And they don't have water. They don't have basic facilities. These are big issues. So there's still more unmasking to be done. But, it's right in front of us.
Right, of course. Professor Narli, I want to take this question to you in another specific context, which comes to the refugees. Now, Turkey houses the largest number of refugees in the world, some 4 million. When we talk about education gaps and pandemic showing us them in a new light completely, what can you tell us about that state of reaching out to refugees and making education more inclusive?
When we look at the Turkish case, there are 3.6 million registered Syrian refugees. They are given the status of being under temporary protection. This means those who are registered can have access to education, health, and many other rights in Turkey. They can, for example, start business. And there are other, 400,000 refugees from Afghanistan, from Iran, Somalia, and from other countries. And when we look at unregistered number of the Syrians, their number is also roughly something like 400,000. And the Turkish government has spent a lot of money and then updated infrastructure in order to meet the educational needs of the Syrian children. And the government was able to integrate 60% of the Syrian children into Turkish formal schooling system. This means they had education with Turkish pupils in the same classroom in Turkish. But what happened with the pandemic, schools closed, and then we start a type of online education, distant education. And when we look at the Syrian refugees, many of them are living in the urban slums and they live in very crowded households. They have access to internet and smartphone. This was my research in 2016. But what happens, maybe they don't have enough digital tools and space to continue their online education. And so I don't have data on the new situation, but the conditions in the slums, crowded houses, and then maybe their internet is not enough.
Right.
I don't know how many computers they have or how many smartphones they have. In the past, I observed that all the adults, they have a smartphone. And I published an article on that. But I don't know whether children were able to continue their education. And the other thing, when I look at many of the Turkish families, their parents, they help the children, to maintain discipline. So children continue their education.
Right. Professor Narli.
I don't know whether the Syrian...
Sorry to interrupt here, but from everything you've said, I do want to point out this other aspect of the report that UNESCO states, which is inclusion also depends on the state of segregation. Now, you mentioned here that Syrian refugee children study side by side with Turkish children. To what degree would you say that segregation has been eliminated in Turkey?
I think, putting Syrian and Turkish children in the same classroom is great, and it is against segregation, and also it is part of the social inclusion policy, because Turkish government shifted policy from, hosting the, let's say, guests to social inclusion policy towards the Syrians. And but the question here is pandemic interrupted education, and now we don't know whether Syrian children continue their education. This is the question. Again, here the problem is structural problems, structural inequalities. Maybe the same applies to Turkish children in the remote areas, in the poor households.
Right. Those are very important points. Mercy, talking on that same point there about segregation and how Professor Narli points out that Turkey has tried to a great extent to make the community more inclusive, to make educational programs more inclusive. But we know that children are divided on several lines throughout society, whether it's class, whether it's gender. When you look at the case of Nigeria, which are some of the most prominent instances of segregation that you find?
You know, like for the case of Nigeria, it's really difficult to be able to say there's a middle ground in terms of specific areas. You're either well-to-do or you're poor. The conversation around the middle class is not there. And when I say this, I link it back to segregation. So how do you define the way education is treated for the poor? Do they have the right tools to study? Do they have the right textbooks? Do they have the right classrooms? There are some states within the country where the classrooms are in the worst deplorable state you can ever imagine. Now, within the states of the federal capital, Abuja, Lagos, and maybe Port Harcourt, these are urban, literally much more urban areas where, even according to educational statistics in the country, you can see that the students are doing much better because beyond the curriculum, beyond the structures, you know, that houses the students to be able to learn, to be able to study. There are teacher training programs as well that enable the teachers to be competent enough to teach children. Some schools you go there, the teachers are not trained. There is limited amount of knowledge a teacher can transfer to a student, which is dependent on what the person knows. So when we're having half-baked, I'm sorry to use that term, when we're having half-baked teachers teaching our students, what we get at the end of the day is half-baked students. And what they've ended up doing is turning educational institutions into degree awarding institutions.
That's such an important point. Mercy, that's an important point. And since I'm short on time, I'm going to take this to Ms. Jamil. Ms. Jamil, in your experience, how much do these teacher training programs help in a teacher being able to make the classroom more inclusive? And as Mercy states, that it's not just an issue about bringing children into a classroom, but it's also about the education they attain, the learning that happens. How important are teacher training programs for this?
I think they're extremely important. I think they are the ones that not just give skills to teachers, but also give them the right attitudes. But I think more important to teacher training programs are that if you do them just in isolation or one-off, or just have a series and you're just taking mark those capacity building sessions, they're not of much use because you are taking a teacher who's a human being and changing attitudes, and it needs a lot of support mechanisms. Often you see a one-off training session, but with very little support, follow-up support, because a teacher, it's difficult for a teacher with a class of about 50 kids, in which, their children definitely deserve more attention and care. The teacher's unable to do it. So with very stretched resources that we have, teacher training is very critical. It matters. But when you look at how the classroom management is, how does a classroom lend itself to teacher being supported inside the classroom for managing inclusion, I think that's another case. We haven't really come to that level. I've seen in Mexico or others where they have created a possibility, not just training, but created a teacher for inclusion with a cluster of about 20 students around school. So the teacher visits a school for 2 days, another school for 1 day, depending upon the number. So it's that kind of, even though we may not have enough resources, but we definitely need a full-fledged system to address issues of inclusion. Just having it in a document or doing a one-off training, I don't think that will do it. It definitely needs much more than just a one-off training.
Definitely does need much more than just a one-off training session. Mr. Jamil, this one last question to you. Now, from a policy perspective, do you think it is practical, and do you think it should be a goal to have teacher training programs or whatever training programs as a prerequisite to teachers actually entering the classroom?
So, yes, of course, it's very important. But as you know, that I'm sure most countries have a pre-service program to prepare teachers. Now, when we started looking at some of that, we were surprised to see even the 4-year B.Ed program did not have sufficient stuff on inclusion or human rights, etc. Now, but when it comes to actually having systems in place when the teachers are working or doing work in schools where there is, and we have done the research, 15% of our children, if you're looking just at disabilities, are children who are desperately in need of attention. And many of them are already mainstreamed in government schools by default, not by design. But the teachers don't know much what to do with them. So they get really ignored and they don't even notice that they are there.
Right.
So there's a long way to go for inclusion, which should be almost 30% of a teacher training program, if not more,
Right.
but also with a lot of support.
Right.
And I think Pakistan is doing quite a bit. They are trying to see how to address it, like in
But there's
Punjab.
a long way to go. But there's a to go. Ms. Jamil, I take your point there. Sorry to interrupt, but we're running short on time. Thank you so much for joining us, Ms. Baela Jamil from Lahore, Mercy Abang from Berlin, and Ms. Professor Nilofer Narli from Istanbul. We're going to go for a short break. When we come back, we discuss the rise in extreme poverty for the first time since 1998. Stay with us. Welcome back. Now, while the fight against global poverty has been made much more difficult because of the pandemic, it's expected that by 2030, up to 2/3 of global extreme poor will be forced to live in fragile and conflict-affected situations. On today's show, we discuss how the pandemic has impacted already vulnerable, fragile, and conflict-affected regions in parts of Africa and what can be done to move forward. Joining us for this conversation is Rosemary, who's a policy analyst at SBM Intelligence, which is Nigeria's leading geopolitical intelligence platform. She joins us from Lagos. Also joining us today is Dr. Ahmed, McLad, who's a medical doctor and a human rights activist. He joins us from Melbourne. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Dr. McLad, I'd like to begin with you. Now, when we talk about already vulnerable regions becoming more vulnerable and fragile because of how extreme poverty will rise, Sub-Saharan Africa is a region of great interest and an example that, of course, should be explored, not just because of what is going to happen now, but also because before the pandemic began, all over the world, extreme poverty was falling, but in this one region, it was on the rise. Why is that?
Well, Sub-Saharan Africa, and in general, this beautiful continent, it had history that led to the poverty that we had in the past. And we're currently experiencing the same pretty much sort of history of conflict that is either proclaimed or, sort of triggered from outside the continent, within the continent, the African countries. This sort of conflicts is the main issue of that is affecting the economy of this rich, continent. Africa is not poor. Africa is busy to get to invest on its own. If you look into the African countries, you will find that most of the wealth is still underground. We haven't digged it. We haven't grown the crops that will feed every African, person. The reason is not just conflict. It's a lot of factors that starts from within the family to go a little bit to a higher limit, the society and the education, and that goes to the government and the policy making process and the international influence also that cannot be ignored in
Dr. McLad,
Africa.
Right, but Doctor, I must press on this point specifically. even with all those issues, when we saw one trend globally, which was a decline in extreme poverty, why did we continue to see it rise here? Do you feel like this region is neglected when it comes to international efforts in trying to reduce poverty, or are the issues more internal?
Well, there are many issues. One of the instability will be the major setback, honestly. If we put on one side the international plans and policies and the effort that most of the world has agreed to achieve in fighting poverty, the one challenge that they properly faced over the last years or so far they are still facing is the instability. Once there is instability in any region, it's impossible that you can implement the process of fighting poverty. You are producing poverty once there is instability and wars.
Right.
Unfortunately, we are talking about fighting poverty, but we're not talking about how we can stop wars itself. And I think the international community can do way more than what they're doing now to stop wars in Africa.
Right. Dr. McLad, I'm going to come back to that point. I'm going to come back to that point about what role the international community can play in all of this. But I'm going to jump to Rosemary. Rosemary, as Dr. McLad points out, that the entire continent is extremely rich. Nigeria is rich in oil. It's rich in diamonds. And yet we see so much conflict. We see so many issues. Do you think that this leads to the resource curse?
Yes. Nigeria is rich in raw resources, the oil, the gold, and all the sorts of resources, basically. But how does it translate to the development of the country? And we are rich in all these natural resources, but how does it translate to our GDP? How does it translate to our health sector, to education? How does it reduce terrorism? How has it affected the standard of living, poverty rates? How has it affected? So basically, it has nothing to do with economic development or political growth. We're just rich, but then there's a systemic issue. There is corruption. There is weak institutions.
Right. Rosemary, now talking about this point that Dr. McLad mentioned, and I said we would come to it, which is the issue of international intervention. We know that many of the issues that are continuing to this day in the continent are also due to its history of colonialism, its history of not being able to develop its institutions in the way it could have. Do you see foreign intervention or foreign support as a positive thing in this scenario, or do you think that it would do more damage than good?
Personally, as an analyst, I think it has done more damage than good for the situation of the country. International affairs into this, or let's say meddling into this situation, has created a revenue channel. It's not that it's nice that corruption or terrorism or violence can create income, because we expect international communities to donate to solving this problem. So now we have almost a legitimate source of income from international body. Also, in some part of Africa, say Nigeria, for example, we have foreign countries meddling into our affairs through violence and terrorism. So basically, I would say that the international community or international policy solution has become more harm than expected to turn out good.
Right. That's an important point you make there, Rosemary. Now, Dr. McLad, do you agree with that the issue of foreign support, of international support, would lead to the conditions and circumstances worsening?
Absolutely. If we can't live alone, we cannot separate Africa as a separate part of the world. We have to get into the same rhythm with the international community. Definitely, there is a positive and a negative sort of intervention. We have political intervention. We have development and sort of supportive intervention. We have governments that are.
But even
not,
with development support, the issue that often arises is that it's not in the best interest of the country itself, but of the country that is supporting the development.
Absolutely. We're talking about repayments before we're talking about what projects can be implemented. We're talking about foreign interest and benefits before the local benefits. We see that, and we've seen that always the case. I think what the African countries really need from the international community is just education into the development, the easier development, like the agricultural sector. If you just tackle that issue of educating the poor communities on how to implement the easier ways of, in agriculture, it will save many out of the severe poverty situation. Unfortunately, we're seeing projects that helps other countries. Even if you see the political governments of the governments in the African countries that are working freely and democratically to help the people of these countries, we don't see, we always see international support to some of the countries that are not democratically elected, and they're actually fueling wars, they're fueling instability that fuels poverty in a direct way. I cannot even call it an indirect way. And unfortunately, we see this case until now, 2020, we see the international community support a dictatorship in a way that helps the international agenda before the localized agenda. And then after we finish the political meeting, we come back.
Dr. McLad, sorry to interject here, but how much of a discrepancy do you think there is in the international agenda and the local agenda when we talk about countries in Africa, when we talk about sub-Saharan Africa?
We talk about broad and large discrepancy. It's obvious, it's clear, it's been there, it's noted, and you cannot hide it.
Right. Just one last one, Dr. McLad. Now, with this pandemic, with conditions worsening, what do you think is the expectation of the local community when we talk about support or when we talk about any type of development aid being given from outside? Because we know that with conditions worsening, there is need for additional support.
Look, absolutely. I can have I have a skeptical sort of comment here. Probably, if you see the American or the British statistics, you'll find that the coronavirus caused a lot of sort of negative effects on the economy. But if you study the African continent, you're probably not going to have a proper study. But even though the studies shows that there is definitely the same level of effect, but definitely on a way less scale into Africa, because there are many countries already with an already failed health sector, let's say. There are many countries that doesn't get even, the health sector doesn't get much support from the government, sort of expenses anyway. So it's not fairly affected. It's the African person, the human being in Africa is more affected. Support is much needed already before the coronavirus. Right. Support is always needed. And I think God bless Africa.
Right. On that point, thank you so much, Dr. Ahmed McLad, from Melbourne, Rosemary and Enemuo for joining us from Lagos. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again tomorrow with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.